welcome to your video on Chapter 9, Part 3. This particular one has to do with irrigation and grazing. Alright, define irrigation and explain how much of the world's fresh water is devoted to irrigation. Irrigation is the artificial provision of water to support agriculture. In other words, rainfall is not irrigation because it is not something that humans have done. So irrigation is basically sprinkling. When you put the sprinklers on the yard, that is a form of irrigation. And 70% of all fresh water that people withdraw is used for irrigation. So by far, most of the world's fresh water is actually used for agriculture. Okay, name one crop that requires lots of water and one crop that does not require much water. Rice and cotton require lots of water. Rice, as a matter of fact, if you look there on the right hand side, has to grow in what's called a boggy condition or a wetland. Unlike most plants, part of it needs to be submerged the entire time that it's grown, so it is absolutely water intensive. It's also something we're going to refer back to when we talk about air pollution. Don't worry about that right now, just realize we're going to loop back. And then beans and wheat do not require much water. The reason that you need to think about this is in areas that there isn't a lot of water available, you do not want to be growing crops that are water intensive. What is waterlogging and how does it affect plant growth? Waterlogging is over irrigating the soil so that you completely saturate the roots with water. Roots actually perform cellular respiration, so they do need air available in air pockets. So by overwatering, you suffocate the roots because they need access to the air. This oftentimes happens when you've got a layer of clay underneath the ground. Clay is not very water permeable, and so if you water too much, the water just sits there and the roots drown and rot in the water. How does salinization occur? In which soil horizon does it occur? Salinization is a buildup of salts in the surface of the soil, or the A horizon, when soil is repeatedly irrigated after the previous irrigation largely evaporates. So, ton of water, evaporation occurs. Ton of water, evaporation occurs. Two things happen there. First, even the freshest of water contains tiny bits of salt, and so when the water evaporates, the salt is left behind. And then secondly, the soil itself contains a lot of salt. So when you have a place that's really warm and or very windy, and so you have high rates of evaporation and you overwater, that means that you draw a lot of salt from subsoil up to the top of the surface of the soil, and then also you get salt from the irrigation water. Irrigation in arid lands generally hastens salinization. Remember, arid lands are those that have desert-like conditions. And then where does the salt come from when salinization takes place? Both the soil and the irrigation water, as I have detailed. Here is salinization in Colorado, and this looks like powdered sugar. It's in fact salt. The reason this is a problem for farming is that salt basically renders the soil sterile. Very few plants can grow in salt water, and so when you have salt in the ground, it keeps plants from growing. Just side note, in ancient Roman times, what they would do in enemy territory when they conquered it is not only would they conquer the land, they would take salt and bury it in the ground so that the people there could no longer grow crops. Alright, what are list 3 ways to reduce the likelihood that salinization will take place. Number 1, plant crops that don't need lots of water. Number 2, make sure that you're irrigating with water that has a low salt content. So that may require that you find a different source. As an example, maybe you're irrigating from the fresher part of an estuary, so that's going to have a salt content, and you switch to maybe well water or an aquifer that's not so salty. And then irrigate efficiently. You just give them what they need when they need it. And you can see here on this slide those perforated pipes that are under the ground can be used to release water directly to the roots just as they need it. Now please keep in mind, as I talk about all of this efficiency use, not only are you to allowing your soil to stay fertile for as long as is humanly possible, you're also spending less money and having more water available for you to drink and cook with and all of that other good stuff. So when we talk about things that are good for the environment, ultimately they're also good for people and for the economy as well. I am going to drop down real quick to number 8. What are 3 ways to correct salinization? Number 1, stop irrigating and wait for rain to flush out the salt. Number 2, plant salt-tolerant plants like barley. That's a plant that you want to remember. And then number 3, flush the soil with large amounts of low salinity water. But that can lead to waterlogging. Ultimately, the best way to clean up salinization is really just don't do it in the first place. Be responsible with the way that you use the water and you will be fine. Alright, back to number 7. This is referring to figure 9.18 in your book, so you may want to take a look at that. Describe the difference between conventional irrigation, center pivot irrigation, and drip irrigation, which is the most efficient. Conventional irrigation is where you spray water into the air over the plants. A lot of that is lost to evaporation. Center pivot is where you spray the crops that are planted in a circle directly down onto the plants, and the reason it's called center pivot is that it is attached to the center of the circular field, and then when you water, it slowly pivots or turns itself so that the field is evenly watered. And then drip irrigation is the most efficient. That's where you bury where you bury flexible piping into the ground that has micropores, so tiny little holes, and it releases very small amounts of water as the plant needs it, so it basically sweats the water into the ground right under the roots so they can take it up directly. Next to no evaporation, very efficient, and you're using less water, less chances of salinization and waterlogging. So here are some pictures for you. This gravity flow, let me go ahead and talk about this now. This is coming from number 20 on your list of questions. Not number 20, excuse me. From number 20. Pages 423 to 424 in a different chapter I'm putting with this. Flood and furrow irrigation, which is there on the far left, accounts for 90% of irrigation worldwide and is the most inefficient type of irrigation, so even more inefficient than just conventional sprinklers. And that is because if you look at the picture, you just dig furrows or basically just ditches into the ground, take a river, divert it into the ditches, and then let the plants take stuff up. You have upwards of 40% of the water is lost to evaporation, so not very efficient. There on the far right, by the way, is the center pivot. Imagine that line of sprinklers is slowly turning. That is what center pivot looks like. And then there's drip irrigation. These flexible tubing is on top of the ground. Oftentimes they're dug directly into the ground. All right, here's some more examples. Left-hand side are those center pivot fields, and you can see they're circular. The reason they're different colors is different things are growing there. And here again you can see this is a rather large operation. Here in the lower right-hand corner is drip irrigation. You can see this one's connected to a well. And then here in the upper right-hand corner, this is flood and furrow irrigation, and lowest tech, highest amount of water loss to evaporation. And that is, by the way, a big drawback of these sprinkler systems is that they require technology in some cases, like if you look at this pump, electricity to make this thing happen. All right, let's see what's next. Excuse me. Compare and contrast inorganic and organic fertilizer. Both contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You'll need to know this later with the supplemental material. Nitrogen, its atomic symbol is N, capital N, phosphorus is capital P, and potassium is capital K. You actually see those 3 letters NPK on bags of inorganic fertilizer. So they both contain those. However, inorganic fertilizer, as we learned in the nitrogen cycle, is made through the Haber-Bosch process. So when we talk about fossil fuels, there is an impact there. Fossil fuel use in terms of air pollution is a part of that process. Okay, organic fertilizer comes from the remains or wastes of organisms, animal manure, crop residues, green manure, which is fresh vegetation, and then compost, which is vegetation that is decomposed into organic matter. So I kind of already hit the next question, compare and contrast green manure, animal manure, and compost. Animal manure is poop, still has a lot of plant matter in it. Animals are not very efficient at breaking all of that down. Green manure, again, is just the straight up fresh clippings, and then compost is the decomposed clippings without having gone through an animal's stomach. What additional soil enrichment benefits do organic fertilizers provide besides additional nutrients? They improve the soil structure, so you have those little pockets of air for the roots, and then also that's a place for water to go. Nutrient retention, again, the water retaining capacity I just talked about, which helps to prevent erosion. So if you've got organic matter in your soil, that in and of itself can prevent the soil from eroding because it will absorb the water as opposed to letting it go. So what you're looking at here on the right hand side is making compost, and here on the left hand side you've got inorganic fertilizer. If you're interested in seeing animal manure, excuse me, our vet teacher currently has his horse on campus. You're welcome to go take a look at the horse apples. That's what they call horse poop, and you can see in it the hay that was not digested by the animal. All right. How does overuse of fertilizer impact water quality? Nitrates in groundwater can have human health impacts. I'm going to talk about what you're looking at here in just a second. Nitrates and phosphates can lead to eutrophication and all of its effects, with which we talked about, hypoxic zones, algae blooms, da-da-da-da-da. Right, what you're looking at right now is the next question, which is what is blue baby syndrome? This is where infants ingest water with high levels of nitrates that asphyxiates and can eventually kill them. You can see the slow asphyxiation that's taking place. It's characterized by the blue lips and tips of the nose and fingers and toes. In your supplemental material, I'll be talking about exactly how that happens. All right, overgrazing. What is it and how does it impact soil quality in 3 ways? That is livestock eating the ground cover to the point that plant regrowth is impeded or impossible. What are its impacts? Number 1, soil erosion. Clearly, if you don't have any plants growing, the soil can wash away or be blown away, which then can, second, foul water supplies. That's not soil quality, but that's still good to know. Possible invasion of non-native weedy plants that are less appetizing to livestock and outcompete native plants because they're generalists. So if you get rid of specialists that are used to living there and then generalists come in, the specialists can never come back. And then compaction of the soil that makes it harder for water to infiltrate the soil and then roots to grow and conduct cellular respiration. So when you have all of those animals standing and walking across that ground for days and weeks at a time, you eventually crush the soil so that there's no space left in between it. How can overgrazing be considered a tragedy of the commons? This is on your own, but I'll help you with this. If rangelands are used by all but managed by none, all the vegetation will get eaten, leaving behind a desert. And as a matter of fact, in the article, The Tragedy of the Commons, Garrett Hardin specifically referred to rangelands in that specific aspect. All right, and science behind the stories. How does fire suppression change the composition of a grassland? The suppression of fires leads to more brush and trees and less grass. What you're looking at here is actually what's called a prescribed fire. This is a good thing. Now, what you would have to consider for yourself later on FRQs is, why do people not want fires to happen? The answer is usually because they live there and they don't want the fires to bother their houses. Of course, the problem is that a lot of these ecosystems are based on fire. It's a natural part of the process, and as I just discussed, if you suppress fires, you actually end up with no more grasslands anymore. You have a forest there. So that's one of the reasons why firefighters, as much as they put out fires, they actually go and do these very controlled fires so that they happen in such a way that they don't threaten human property or lives, but still allow the natural ecosystem to continue. All right, so which law ties governmental farming benefits to soil conservation? That's the Food Security Act. Guys, you're just going to have to write these down and just force them into your brain. Which program pays farmers to stop cultivating highly erodible cropland? The Conservation Reserve Program, now called the Federal Agricultural Improvement and Reform Act, or the Freedom to Farm Act. So this is actually kind of funny. The Freedom to Farm Act is where you pay farmers to stop cultivating the wrong kind of land. Highly erodible means that it's very likely that soil erosion is going to take place there and you're going to turn it into a desert. So you literally pay farmers, don't farm there. Go take this money and go farm somewhere else that's better. Which organization supports the international conservation of soil? The United Nations through something called the Food and Agriculture Organization, or the FAO. All right. I will tell you that next week you're going to be getting a list of laws and organizations that you need to start memorizing. Those will go into your notebook. Those are things you absolutely need to know, not only for multiple choice, but also for free response. So it's not always something that you're just going to be able to use your best guessing skills on. They're things you're actually going to need to be able to quote on a free response question. And that is the end of Chapter 9.